At 9:14 a.m., the Harrington Wealth Group compliance system registered something it was never designed to question. A single authorization line that quietly unlocked and moved $80 million out of managed holdings without a single phone call, without hesitation, without a warning that could be reversed in time. And across the glass walls of the 23rd floor trading office, screens flickered as alerts stacked in silence. Not loud enough to cause panic at first, but precise enough that every analyst who saw them stopped typing. Somewhere inside the building, a junior compliance officer whispered that the system must be glitching because accounts at that tier did not move like this, not in seconds, not without committee approval, not without signatures from people who usually needed 3 meetings just to agree on lunch. Yet the numbers kept updating, recalculating exposure, adjusting risk models in real time, as if the institution itself had just lost its balance and could not find its footing again. In the middle of it all, Victoria Hale walked out of the glass conference room on the upper floor, her pace unhurried, her expression unchanged, carrying nothing that suggested urgency, not even the faintest trace that anything unusual had happened behind her. And the receptionist at the elevator only noticed her long enough to step aside, assuming she was just another executive finishing a routine consultation. No one stopped her. No one asked questions. That was the pattern in places like Harrington Wealth Group, where confidence was often mistaken for authority and silence was mistaken for compliance. But 30 minutes earlier, the air in that same building had been different, heavier in a way that did not show up on any system report. Victoria had entered the advisory room alone, dressed in a simple black coat, no visible branding, no indicators of status that the room's occupants could immediately categorize. Richard Collins had glanced up from his tablet with the kind of polite disinterest reserved for clients he assumed would never move the needle, while Amanda Brooks had already begun scanning Victoria's file with the subtle skepticism of someone trained to detect unqualified wealth. The first words spoken were not welcoming, just procedural, sharp enough to draw a line between those who belonged and those who were being evaluated for permission to stay. Daniel Price, seated near the corner with a junior analyst badge still slightly crooked on his blazer, noticed something different, though he could not name it yet. A mismatch between the calmness in Victoria's posture and the way the system had quietly elevated her profile to a tier most advisors rarely saw in their entire careers. But Richard had already leaned back, dismissing the nuance, suggesting in polite financial language that her portfolio complexity might exceed her understanding. And Amanda had followed with a suggestion that restructuring her holdings might be more appropriate under standard advisory supervision, a phrase that sounded harmless but carried a very specific meaning in rooms like this. Victoria did not respond immediately. She simply listened, as if measuring every assumption being placed in front of her, not with anger, but with calculation, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm enough to make the room feel slightly smaller, asking one question that none of them answered directly. What exactly makes you think you are reviewing my money as opposed to simply looking at it? The silence that followed was brief, but it was the kind of silence that does not disappear, it lingers, and it was that same silence that would later echo through the compliance alerts when the $80 million began to move. Because in institutions like Harrington, money does not just leave, it is taken apart piece by piece. And someone always notices too late that the person they underestimated never needed permission to begin with. Inside the advisory room on the 23rd floor, the atmosphere had not changed immediately, yet something about it had shifted in a way that could not be ignored by anyone paying attention closely enough, as if the room itself had recalibrated around a presence that did not need to raise its voice to be felt. Richard Collins adjusted his posture slightly, glancing at the portfolio display again as if expecting the numbers to behave differently under a second look, while Amanda Brooks maintained a composed expression that was beginning to strain at the edges of certainty. The system interface on the large monitor continued to update quietly, reflecting asset movement patterns that no longer aligned with standard advisory timelines, and Daniel Price, still seated near the corner, leaned forward just enough to confirm what he was seeing was not a simulation or delayed sync. The name associated with the active authorization layer remained unchanged, and that was what unsettled him most, because it did not belong to any client they typically handled without multiple escalation reviews. Richard finally broke the silence with a carefully measured comment about needing additional verification layers, suggesting that high-value liquidity shifts of this magnitude usually required confirmation from a secondary trustee authority. But even as he spoke, his tone carried less confidence than before, as if the words were being spoken to stabilize himself rather than the situation. Amanda followed quickly, adding that the allocation structure appeared unusually centralized for someone categorized under standard advisory segmentation, and she looked toward Victoria with a polite smile that no longer fully matched her earlier certainty. Victoria remained still, her hands resting lightly near the edge of the table, her attention not on them, but on the quiet rhythm of notifications continuing to accumulate across their internal dashboard, each one marking a step further away from control. When she finally spoke again, her voice remained steady, almost conversational, asking whether their assessment of risk was based on actual oversight or simply on assumptions formed before they had even opened her full account history. The question lingered longer than expected because it did not invite a simple answer, and Daniel noticed that Amanda briefly glanced away from the screen, as if realizing something she had overlooked. The system then triggered a secondary alert, one that confirmed the withdrawal instruction had originated from an authenticated authority layer tied to ownership level credentials, not advisory permission sets, and that detail changed the air in the room more than any spoken sentence could. Richard straightened slightly, his earlier ease replaced by a more careful tone as he asked Victoria if she had authorized an institutional reallocation, though the phrasing now carried a subtle shift from guidance to concern. Victoria did not confirm or deny immediately. Instead, she asked whether it was unusual for someone to adjust their own financial structure without requiring external approval, and the simplicity of the question exposed the assumption embedded in the entire conversation. Daniel watched the exchange carefully, realizing that what the advisors had treated as a routine evaluation had in fact been an encounter with someone operating on a completely different access level within the same system. Amanda finally checked a deeper layer of the interface, her expression tightening as she recognized restricted classification markers that were not visible in standard client views, and for the first time, she stopped speaking mid-thought. Richard attempted to regain control of the conversation by suggesting a pause in execution until internal review could be completed, but even as he said it, another update appeared, confirming that the transaction sequence was already past reversible stages within the institutional framework. Victoria then stood up calmly, collecting her tablet without urgency, and looked at both advisors, as if observing the moment they realized the conversation had never been about advice at all. She did not raise her voice, nor did she display satisfaction, only clarity, as she stated that assumptions built without full visibility tend to collapse the moment actual authority is revealed, and then she turned toward the exit, leaving behind a room that had begun to understand too late that control had never been where they believed it was. By the time Victoria Hale reached the elevator lobby, the building no longer felt like a neutral space designed for financial precision, but instead like a system that had just discovered a gap in its own assumptions and did not yet know how to respond to it. Behind her, inside the advisory room, Richard Collins remained standing longer than necessary, staring at the screen as the withdrawal sequence continued updating in controlled increments, each line of data confirming that the movement of capital was not accidental, not a misfire, and not something that could be reversed through standard escalation protocols. Amanda Brooks had already moved to her workstation, attempting to trace the authorization pathway through deeper compliance layers, but the structure kept returning the same classification marker, one that indicated ownership-level initiation rather than advisory approval, and that distinction created a silence in her expression that replaced every earlier certainty. Daniel Price, still seated, finally opened the internal audit viewer that junior staff rarely accessed without permission, and what he saw forced him to pause longer than he intended, because the account designation tied to Victoria Hale did not simply exist within their client hierarchy. It extended beyond it into a restricted portfolio architecture typically reserved for institutional founders and controlling stakeholders. He did not speak immediately, not because he was unsure of what he saw, but because he understood that saying it aloud would change the temperature of the room permanently. Meanwhile, Victoria stepped into the elevator without urgency, Pressing the button for the ground floor, as if nothing of consequence had just occurred, her reflection steady in the polished metal doors as they closed. On the ride down, notifications continued to populate across internal systems behind her, escalating from advisory alerts to compliance review flags, then to executive oversight notifications that began reaching individuals far above the floor she had just left. At the 31st floor, a senior operations manager received the alert and initially dismissed it as a timing inconsistency, until the system refreshed again and confirmed that the $80 million movement had already cleared through verified authority channels tied to ownership override credentials. That was the moment hesitation replaced confidence across multiple departments. Simultaneously, in the advisory room, Amanda finally spoke again, her voice lower now, suggesting that they might be dealing with a client whose portfolio structure had not been fully mapped within their visible interface. But even as she said it, she knew the phrase sounded insufficient. Richard responded more cautiously than before, proposing that they initiate a temporary hold review, though his tone no longer carried the certainty of someone managing a routine case, but instead the uncertainty of someone realizing the framework they relied on might not apply in this situation. Daniel, still focused on the audit layer, noticed a secondary designation appear beneath Victoria Hale's profile, one that reclassified her not as a managed client, but as a controlling entity within the same financial ecosystem, and the realization made him sit back slightly, his attention shifting from confusion to recognition. He remembered the way she had spoken earlier, not defensively, not emotionally, but with the calm precision of someone who was not explaining herself, but simply observing how others misunderstood her position. As Victoria exited the building, stepping into the daylight outside Harrington Wealth Group, her phone remained silent, but inside the institution, communication channels were beginning to open in rapid succession as supervisors, compliance officers, and executive reviewers attempted to reconcile what had just happened with what their systems had always assumed was impossible. No one had yet spoken her name with full understanding, but the process of correction had already begun, and it was moving faster than the hesitation that had allowed the misunderstanding to exist in the first place. Outside the Harrington Wealth Group tower, the afternoon light reflected off the glass facade as if nothing inside had changed, yet inside the building every layer of communication had already begun to fracture under the weight of what had just been discovered. Victoria Hale stood briefly on the sidewalk, not looking back at the entrance, her expression unchanged as she checked a single notification on her phone confirming that the authorization sequence had completed. Without interruption, behind her, the institution she had just walked out of was no longer operating in its usual rhythm, as internal systems across multiple departments continued to cascade alerts upward, each one confirming that the movement of capital was not an anomaly, but a validated execution from an authority layer that very few employees had ever encountered directly. Inside the advisory floor, Richard Collins was no longer speaking in confident financial language, instead pacing slightly while replaying every assumption he had made during the session, realizing that what he had treated as a standard client evaluation had been something entirely different in structure and scale. Amanda Brooks remained seated at her workstation, now cross-referencing internal classification logs against restricted portfolio markers, and what she found forced her to slow her breathing, because the designation tied to Victoria Hale did not just indicate wealth, it indicated structural influence over the very system they were attempting to advise her within. Daniel Price, still at his desk, had opened an internal reference archive usually reserved for senior analysts, and as he compared the profile metadata against institutional ownership layers, the pattern became undeniable, not in a dramatic way, but in a precise and technical one that left no room for interpretation. He leaned back slightly, not because he was shocked anymore, but because he understood that the conversation they had just participated in had never been symmetrical. Meanwhile, on the executive floor, a compliance director had joined the alert channel and requested confirmation of execution pathways, but every response pointed back to the same result: ownership level authorization, verified, and complete. That phrase repeated across systems like a quiet correction, as if the institution itself was adjusting its understanding of reality in real time. Amanda finally spoke again, this time suggesting that they escalate the matter to institutional oversight immediately, But her tone lacked urgency now and carried more recognition than resistance, as if she already knew escalation would not undo what had been. Confirmed. Richard stopped pacing and looked toward the screen again, realizing that the $80 million movement was not a withdrawal in the traditional sense, but a reallocation under structural authority that placed the origin of control outside their advisory jurisdiction entirely. Daniel, however, remained focused on one detail that had not changed since the moment Victoria entered the room: her calm. It was not the calm of someone trying to prove something, but the calm of someone who had already accounted for every possible reaction in advance. As he reviewed the sequence logs again, he noticed that the system had flagged multiple advisory assumptions as non-compliant interpretive bias indicators, not as errors in data, but as errors in judgment classification. That distinction stayed with him longer than anything else. Outside, Victoria entered a waiting vehicle without assistance, closing the door gently as the city moved around her with normal pace, unaware that a structural correction had just occurred inside one of its financial institutions. Her phone remained in her hand for a moment longer, then she placed it aside, as if the matter had already resolved itself without requiring further attention. Back inside Harrington Wealth Group, the first executive inquiry request was officially submitted, marking the transition from confusion to investigation. And for the first time since the beginning of the day, the building was no longer reacting to a client, but to the realization that the client had never been within their actual control to begin with. By the time the first executive inquiry reached the upper compliance division at Harrington Wealth Group, the situation had already shifted from a routine financial review into a full internal investigation, although no one inside the building was yet willing to describe it in those terms out loud. The language used in the official communication remained carefully neutral, referencing system validation discrepancies and high-tier authorization review. But every person who read it understood the underlying meaning. Something within their assumed hierarchy of control had failed to behave according to expectation. In a glass conference room on the 35th floor, a senior compliance executive reviewed the transaction timeline in silence, watching the $80 million movement unfold across the audit interface with precise timestamps that confirmed there had been no breach, no error, and no unauthorized access. The only explanation the system offered was the same one repeated across multiple layers of verification: ownership-level execution confirmed. That phrase now appeared in multiple reports, and with each repetition, the confidence of the institution's internal narrative weakened slightly. In the advisory department below, Richard Collins had stopped attempting to frame the situation as a misunderstanding and instead began focusing on reconstructing the entire meeting from memory, searching for any moment where he might have misinterpreted the signals in front of him. He could now recall how Victoria Hale had never once requested approval, only clarity, and how every assumption he had made about her role in the system had been based entirely on visual and behavioral bias rather than data. Amanda Brooks, still seated at her terminal, had expanded her review into historical classification logs, where she discovered that Victoria Hale's profile had been accessed multiple times over the past year by senior institutional stakeholders without ever triggering advisory visibility, meaning that the entire firm had been operating with partial awareness of a client who was structurally above their decision-making tier. That realization did not create panic in her expression, but something closer to professional recalibration, as if she was adjusting to a framework that had suddenly revealed itself to be incomplete. Daniel Price, however, had moved beyond interpretation and into confirmation, cross-referencing ownership registry layers that were not typically part of his assigned responsibilities, and what he found aligned with everything the system had already implied but the advisory team had failed to recognize in time. Victoria Hale was not simply a client within their ecosystem. She was structurally embedded within it at a level that rendered standard advisory authority secondary. On the executive floor, a meeting was quickly assembled, though it did not yet have a formal agenda, because the primary objective was no longer service correction but institutional understanding. Screens displayed synchronized logs of authorization pathways, and every trace led back to the same conclusion: an authenticated ownership directive that bypassed advisory discretion entirely. One executive attempted to question whether the system had misclassified the source of authority, but the audit trail remained consistent, refusing to provide alternative interpretations. Meanwhile, outside the building, Victoria remained in motion, now several blocks away, her presence already detached from the environment that was still attempting to categorize her. She did not receive any additional notifications because none were necessary. The execution had already completed, and the system had already adjusted to its own correction. Back inside Harrington Wealth Group, the language of urgency had finally replaced the language of confusion, and the institution began preparing for direct board-level escalation, not to challenge what had occurred, but to understand how it had been misunderstood for as long as it had. And in that shift, a quiet realization began to form across multiple departments at once, that the most significant failure of the day had not been financial execution, but perception itself. By the time the internal escalation reached the board-level review channel at Harrington Wealth Group, the institution was no longer reacting to a single financial event, but to a structural contradiction it could not resolve within its existing framework. And that distinction changed the tone of every conversation taking place behind closed doors. In a secured executive conference room, the senior board liaison officer reviewed the consolidated audit feed, watching synchronized data streams from compliance, advisory, and ownership verification systems align around the same conclusion that no one had been comfortable stating directly in earlier discussions. The movement of $80 million had not triggered any breach alerts, no override warnings, and no unauthorized access flags, which meant the system itself was confirming legitimacy at the highest possible classification layer. Yet the discomfort in the room came not from error, but from accuracy that exceeded expectation. Multiple executives attempted to reframe the situation as a classification oversight, suggesting that a misalignment between client visibility layers and advisory permissions might explain the confusion. But every attempt to reinterpret the data was quietly invalidated by the audit trail, which consistently identified the origin as ownership authority execution. Meanwhile, across lower floors, Richard Collins was no longer participating in any formal review process and instead remained focused on reconstructing the sequence of his interaction with Victoria Hale, realizing that every question she had asked had been structurally diagnostic rather than conversational. Amanda Brooks had expanded her analysis into legacy portfolio mapping systems, where she discovered that Victoria's financial footprint extended across multiple institutional layers that had been segmented for security reasons, meaning that her presence in the advisory room had never required validation in the first place, only recognition. Daniel Price, still at his workstation, had begun documenting discrepancies between perceived client hierarchy and actual system authority distribution, and his notes reflected a growing realization that the firm's internal classification model had failed to distinguish between managed wealth and controlling equity influence. On the upper executive floor, the board liaison finally spoke, not to assign blame, but to request confirmation of whether any advisory representative had attempted to restrict or question the execution process, and the silence that followed was more revealing than any answer could have been. Down in the main advisory space, Richard and Amanda were now operating in a subdued state of retrospective understanding, recognizing that their earlier interpretations had been shaped entirely by assumption rather than system visibility, and that what they had perceived as an unusual client behavior pattern had actually been consistent with ownership-level autonomy all along. The institution itself, through its layered reporting structure, began issuing corrective documentation prompts, instructing departments to reclassify the event under verified authority execution rather than discretionary client activity, and this procedural adjustment marked the final transition from confusion to institutional acceptance. Outside the building, Victoria Hale had already moved beyond the perimeter of the firm's immediate operational awareness, her role in the system no longer requiring active confirmation because the transaction had completed and been fully validated at every required level. Her phone remained inactive, not because of disconnection, but because no further authorization was necessary. Inside Harrington Wealth Group, however, the realization had fully matured into a single shared understanding across departments that the error had never been in execution, but in perception, and that what had been dismissed as an unremarkable advisory session had in fact been an encounter with authority operating at a level the system had recorded, but the people had failed to recognize in time. By the time the official internal review shifted into structured board oversight, Harrington Wealth Group was no longer treating the situation as a single operational anomaly, but as a full institutional correction event that required alignment across compliance, legal, and executive governance channels. And that shift fundamentally changed how every department interpreted what had occurred earlier that afternoon. In the secured board observation room, the Senior Oversight Committee reviewed the final consolidated report, where every data stream from advisory, transaction processing, and ownership verification systems converged into a single uninterrupted conclusion. The $80 million movement had been executed under authenticated authority that originated at the highest structural level of the financial framework. No exceptions, no irregularities, and no override triggers were recorded. Instead, the system displayed continuous validation markers confirming legitimacy at each checkpoint, from initiation to settlement. Despite this, the silence in the room carried a weight that did not come from confusion anymore, but from recognition of misjudgment at scale. One executive attempted to articulate a procedural explanation, suggesting that advisory personnel may have misinterpreted client classification boundaries, but even as the sentence was spoken, the language felt inadequate against the certainty of the audit trail. Another board member reviewed the historical access logs tied to Victoria Hale's profile and discovered repeated instances where her financial authority had bypassed standard advisory visibility layers entirely, meaning that what the firm had treated as exceptional behavior was in fact consistent with her operational classification all along. Meanwhile, in the lower advisory division, Richard Collins had ceased attempting to rationalize the interaction and instead focused on the structural implications of what he had experienced, realizing that every assumption he made about client hierarchy had been based on visual interpretation rather than system truth. Amanda Brooks, working through layered institutional archives, now understood that Victoria Hale's presence in their advisory room had not been an invitation for evaluation, but a rare instance of direct system interaction from a controlling authority entity within the firm's own financial ecosystem. Daniel Price, whose role had initially been observational, had now begun compiling internal discrepancy documentation, noting that advisory-level access had never been sufficient to interpret the full scope of certain client classifications, and that the firm's training framework had not prepared staff to recognize ownership-level execution when it presented without external indicators. On the executive floor, the Oversight Committee finalized its preliminary conclusion draft, carefully avoiding language that implied failure, instead using terms such as visibility misalignment and hierarchical recognition gap. But even those softened phrases could not fully obscure the underlying reality that the institution had misread authority embedded within its own system. At the same time, automated governance protocols initiated a retrospective correction process, updating internal classification records to reflect ownership-verified execution authority, ensuring that all future references to the event would be stored under confirmed structural legitimacy. In the advisory department, Richard and Amanda both remained unusually quiet, not because there was uncertainty left to resolve, but because the implications had already settled into understanding. Daniel finally closed his terminal and sat back, recognizing that what they had experienced was not a failed advisory interaction, but a demonstration of systemic hierarchy that had been invisible only because they had never been positioned to see it. Outside the building, the afternoon continued without interruption, but within Harrington Wealth Group, every level of leadership had reached the same unavoidable conclusion. The institution had not lost control of a client. It had simply failed to recognize where control had always been located. By the time the final internal consolidation report was circulated across Harrington Wealth Group's executive distribution channel, the institution had fully transitioned from uncertainty into structured containment, meaning every department was now operating under a unified interpretation of the event that had occurred earlier in the day. And that interpretation no longer centered on disruption, but on correction of internal understanding. The report itself was brief, clinical, and deliberately restrained in language, describing the incident as an ownership-verified execution event with no compliance violations, no advisory errors, and no system integrity breaches. But despite its neutral tone, every executive who read it understood the deeper implication that the institution had misclassified authority within its own framework. In the board observation suite, the Senior Oversight Committee reviewed the final confirmation log one last time, watching the synchronized validation markers across multiple financial layers settle into a stable state, indicating that the $80 million reallocation was now fully integrated into the controlling structure of the system. There was no longer any trace of reversibility or ambiguity, only confirmation. Meanwhile, across the advisory floor, Richard Collins remained seated longer than usual after the official closure notification appeared on his terminal, not because there was further analysis to complete, but because he was processing the realization that the entire interaction had never been within his interpretive authority to begin with. Amanda Brooks had already shifted her focus from incident review to structural mapping correction, updating internal notes to reflect that certain client profiles required classification visibility beyond standard advisory permissions, and in doing so she effectively acknowledged that the framework she had relied on was incomplete by design. Daniel Price, however, had moved into a quiet observational state, reviewing the final audit summary where Victoria Hale's designation had been formally confirmed as ownership tier authority within the institutional ecosystem, and that confirmation eliminated any remaining ambiguity about the nature of the encounter. On the executive level, discussions turned toward procedural refinement rather than accountability, with emphasis placed on improving recognition protocols for future high-authority interactions, ensuring that advisory staff would not repeat the same classification misinterpretation. The language used in these discussions remained carefully structured, avoiding emotional framing, instead focusing on system clarity, hierarchy visibility, and execution-level identification accuracy. Outside the building, the afternoon had fully transitioned into early evening, and Victoria Hale's presence was no longer tracked within any active operational dashboard, not because she had been removed, but because her involvement had reached completion within the system's own logic. Her actions required no further monitoring, no additional verification, and no institutional response. Back inside Harrington Wealth Group, the final version of the incident record was archived under Executive Verified Authority execution, marking the conclusion of all active review cycles. What remained was not confusion nor conflict, but a permanent recalibration of institutional awareness, where every department had quietly accepted the same underlying truth. The system had not failed in execution. It had simply failed in recognition, and that failure had already been corrected by the moment it was understood. By the time the final institutional closure notice was issued across Harrington Wealth Group's internal systems, the event had already transitioned into a permanent archive classification, meaning that what had begun as an advisory misunderstanding had now been fully absorbed into the firm's structural memory as a confirmed ownership-level execution, and no further active review threads remained open. The language of the final notice was precise and intentionally restrained, stating that all transaction activity had been validated under authenticated authority, all advisory interpretations had been corrected through retrospective analysis, and all compliance pathways had been reconciled with system-level verification logs. Within the Executive Oversight Suite, the Senior Committee performed a final confirmation pass, reviewing the consolidated timeline one last time, where every timestamp aligned without deviation, reinforcing that the $80 million movement had not only been legitimate, but structurally inevitable within the framework of authority hierarchy that governed the institution. There was no debate remaining in the room, only acknowledgement that the interpretation phase had ended and the documentation phase had begun. On the advisory floor, Richard Collins had already cleared his desk, his focus no longer on the transaction itself, but on the realization that professional perception had been the primary variable in the entire sequence, and that the system had functioned correctly even when human interpretation had not. Amanda Brooks had finalized her internal report adjustment, updating classification notes to reflect that certain client profiles required ownership tier visibility awareness training, effectively embedding the lesson into procedural structure rather than personal reflection. Daniel Price remained slightly longer, reviewing the final archived entry where Victoria Hale's designation was now permanently recorded as controlling authority participant within the firm's financial ecosystem, and he understood that this classification would remain unchanged regardless of future advisory encounters. Outside the building, The evening had settled fully, and Harrington Wealth Group's glass exterior reflected the steady movement of the city, unchanged and unaware of the internal recalibration that had just concluded within its walls. Victoria Hale was no longer present in any operational feed, not because she had been removed, but because her interaction with the institution had reached completion at the highest level of system recognition, leaving no residual requirement for tracking or engagement. Inside the firm, final procedural summaries were distributed across departments, emphasizing system accuracy, authority recognition improvement, and advisory classification refinement, all framed in the neutral language of institutional development. Yet beneath that structured language, every individual who had been part of the day's events carried the same quiet understanding that no report could fully express. The system had not corrected a mistake of execution. It had corrected a mistake of perception, and in doing so it had permanently redrawn the boundary between assumed control and actual authority.